My husband's coffin was still in the ground when my son leaned close and hissed, "Don't expect a dime from Dad's $55 million estate." The funeral was held on a gray March morning in Chicago. The church was packed. Old business associates, neighbors, and distant relatives who hadn't spoken to us in years, but somehow found their way back when money was in the air. My husband, Robert, had been a self-made man, the kind people wrote magazine profiles about, a steel worker's son who built an empire in construction, who turned small contracts into skyscrapers and real estate portfolios. By the time he was 50, his name carried weight, his signature opened doors. I was with him through it all, through the nights when he came home smelling of dust and concrete, through the years when our kitchen doubled as his office, through the decades when deals rose and fell like the stock market. We weren't perfect, but we were partners. He used to say, "Linda, you're my compass. Without you, I'd lose my way." And maybe that was true until cancer came, silent and merciless, and took him in less than 9 months. At the front row of the church, I sat alone, dressed in black. My son, Daniel, sat beside me, 31 years old, my only child. He looked the part of a grieving son, dark suit, polished shoes, neatly combed hair. But there was no sorrow in his eyes, only calculation. His father had barely been gone 48 hours, and already I could see gears turning behind his expression. When the service ended, mourners filed past, offering me their scripted condolences. He was a great man. He'll be missed. Stay strong. I nodded, whispered thank you, my mind somewhere else entirely, because Daniel had just delivered a blow no disease ever could. I'd leaned toward him during the final hymn, expecting comfort. Instead, his whisper cut like a blade. "Don't expect a dime from Dad's $55 million estate." I didn't respond. Couldn't. My lips parted, but the words turned ash before they reached the air. Later, at the graveside, I watched him shake hands with attorneys, real estate agents, people he called friends, but who had never once sat at our dinner table. He carried himself like the heir to a throne. I caught fragments of his conversations. Transition of assets, managing liquidity, next steps. He sounded more like a CEO preparing for a board meeting than a son mourning his father. Back at the house, things became clearer. Robert's study, the room lined with leather-bound books, trophies, and framed photographs of construction projects, was locked. Daniel had the key. He claimed his father left instructions with him that certain documents were to remain private for now. When I asked, "What about me?" his jaw tightened. "Dad trusted me with the details," he said. "You wouldn't understand the complexity of it all." I should have shouted, should have reminded him that I stood by Robert long before Daniel could even spell the word inheritance. But I didn't. Instead, I watched my son, the boy I raised, the man I thought I knew, turn into a stranger before my eyes. That night, the house was quiet, too quiet. For 30 years, Robert's laughter, his booming voice on the phone, the sound of his shoes on the hardwood floor had filled every corner. Now there was only silence. I walked past his empty chair, past the cold fireplace, and sat in the dark. My phone buzzed with a new email. It was from Daniel. No greeting, no warmth. Just a list. Asset transfers, property appraisals, meetings with accountants. At the bottom, one line stood out in bold. "I'll handle everything. Don't interfere." I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. Somewhere deep inside, something shifted. Not grief, not anger exactly, but a colder resolve. Robert might have left this world, but I wasn't about to be erased from it. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments about which country you're watching this video from. Enjoy the story. Because what Daniel didn't know was that I wasn't as powerless as he believed. Robert and I had shared everything, even secrets Daniel never imagined. And those secrets would become my only weapon in a war I never thought I'd have to fight. The morning after the funeral, I woke to the sound of voices downstairs. When I stepped into the hallway, I could hear them clearly, Daniel along with 2 men I didn't recognize. Their tones were brisk, professional, and almost celebratory. I walked down slowly, listening. Dividing the liquid assets first, one man said. That ensures the transition is smoother. Your father was thorough, Daniel. Daniel's voice answered, sharp and confident. I'll take full control. My mother won't be involved in day-to-day decisions. I froze on the stairs. My mother, as though I were some irrelevant bystanders, some fragile widow meant to be tucked away while the real players divided the spoils. When I entered the room, all three men turned. Daniel's smile was forced, his eyes cold. Mom, he said, you should rest. We're handling business matters. I looked at the strangers. One introduced himself as an estate attorney, the other as a financial advisor. Both men shook my hand politely but avoided my eyes, as though they'd already chosen their side. I'd like to hear what's being discussed, I said, keeping my voice calm. Daniel's jaw flexed. It's complicated. Dad trusted me with this. You don't need the stress. Stress. That word hung in the air like an insult. I wanted to scream that I'd handled stress long before Daniel was born, that I was Robert's partner through every rise and fall. But instead, I sat down at the table and folded my hands. Explain it, I said. The attorney cleared his throat. Mr. Briggs's estate is sizable. His last will and testament place his son, Daniel, as executor. He glanced at me quickly, which gives him authority to manage the estate's distribution. I felt the room tilt slightly. Executive, authority. I had heard these words before, but never like this. And what about me? I asked. The attorney hesitated. Daniel jumped in. You'll be taken care of, Mom. Dad wanted that. But the details are complicated, and I'm simplifying things. Trust me. I didn't trust him. Not anymore. That night, I went into Robert's study after Daniel had left with his advisors. The door was locked, but the old house held its secrets, and so did I. Robert and I used to joke about hiding spots, the hollow in the mantel, the loose floorboard beneath his desk. He'd shown me once, years ago, how to slip a thin knife blade under the latch when he misplaced his key. He said, always know your way in, even when you're locked out. I remembered. The lock clicked open easily. The room smelled like him, leather, cigar smoke, paper. I stood there in the quiet, scanning shelves, the desk, the cabinets. Files were stacked neatly, but the drawer I needed was locked. I knelt, slipped the knife again, and opened it. Inside was a folder marked in Robert's handwriting. Personal, for Linda. My hands trembled as I opened it. The first page was a letter, dated 6 months before he died. If you're reading this, Linda, it means I didn't make it. Don't let Daniel steamroll you. He's headstrong, but he doesn't understand loyalty. You do. The assets aren't as straightforward as they seem. I made provisions you'll need to uncover piece by piece. Start with the Montana property. It's the key. Montana property. I'd never heard of it. Robert and I had investments, yes, but Montana? I scanned the rest of the folder. Deeds, account numbers, photocopies of wire transfers. Some were highlighted in yellow, with notes scribbled in Robert's blocky handwriting. Trust fund, secured. Pension, protected. Estate clause, conditional. Conditional. That word sent a chill through me. The next evening, Daniel confronted me. You've been in Dad's study. I kept my face still. It's my house, too. His lips curled into a sneer. Not for long. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just grief or arrogance. It was war. Because Robert hadn't trusted his son with everything. He had trusted me. And buried somewhere in those papers, in some property in Montana, lay the piece of truth that could unravel Daniel's entire plan. But I couldn't act recklessly. I had to move as Robert would have, quietly, strategically, waiting for the right moment. Daniel thought he was in control. He thought I was broken. But I wasn't. And soon, he would learn that Robert's empire wasn't built on greed. It was built on foresight. And foresight was now mine to wield. 2 days after finding Robert's letter, I booked a flight to Montana. I didn't tell Daniel. I didn't tell anyone. If Robert had left me a secret, I would have needed to uncover it before my son or his advisors sniffed it out. The airport was quiet, the kind of place where people recognized each other's faces. I rented a car and drove through miles of pine-covered roads until I reached the small town of Livingston. At the county recorder's office, I asked about property under Robert Briggs's name. The clerk looked at me curiously, then typed into her computer. "Yes," she said after a pause. "There's a cabin registered here. 10 acres, listed as Briggs Holdings, LLC. A cabin." I tried to imagine Robert, the man who loved glass towers and city skylines, owning a rustic cabin in Montana. It didn't fit, unless it wasn't the cabin itself that mattered, but what it contained. When I drove out there, snow crunched beneath my tires. The cabin was small, weathered, almost abandoned looking, but the lock on the front door was new. I turned the key Robert had tucked into the folder, and it clicked open smoothly. Inside, the place was bare except for a stone fireplace, a wooden table, and a safe tucked into the corner. My heart pounded. The safe had a keypad, and I froze. What code could he have used? I tried birthdays, our wedding date, even on the date we bought our first house. Nothing worked. Finally, I thought of Robert's old Army service number, the one he'd repeated so often when telling war stories. I typed it in. The safe beeped, then clicked open. Inside were folders stacked neatly. The first was labeled Trust Accounts, Daniel. The second, Trust Accounts, Linda. And a third, marked simply Contingency. I opened the Daniel file first. It was filled with legal documents showing that yes, Robert had millions left for his son. But there were strings attached, conditions Daniel had never mentioned. The money would only be released in stages, tied to benchmarks, financial responsibility, charitable donations, no criminal activity, no substance abuse. If Daniel failed in any of these, his inheritance would be frozen. I felt a flicker of grim satisfaction. Robert had known his son too well. Then I opened my file. Inside was proof that Robert had safeguarded me. Joint accounts, properties in my name, and a separate pension fund Daniel couldn't touch. He'd hidden it from his son, probably knowing Daniel's arrogance would blind him to the possibility that his father hadn't given him everything. But it was the contingency file that chilled me. Inside were photographs, financial statements, and signed affidavits from lawyers Robert had trusted, all pointing to one truth. If Daniel ever tried to force me out, he would lose everything. Robert had written it down in plain words. If my son acts in bad faith against my wife, Linda Briggs, all assets revert to her control. The estate will bypass him entirely. I sat back, breathless. Robert had built his empire on contracts and conditions, and even in death, he'd left one final safety net for me. But if Daniel discovered this clause, he would stop at nothing to bury it. That night, I stayed in the cabin. The silence of the woods pressed around me, but my phone shattered the stillness. A text from Daniel. "Where are you?" Another followed. "You think I don't know what you're doing. You'll regret this." My chest tightened. How had he found out? Had he tracked me? Or was it just a guess, a shot in the dark? I didn't answer. Instead, I packed the files into a travel bag and left before dawn. The icy road back to the airport felt longer than before, each shadow on the roadside making me glance over my shoulder. When I returned to Chicago, Daniel was waiting. He stood in the driveway, his arms folded, eyes sharp. "Montana?" he asked, his voice low. I didn't respond. He stepped closer, his face twisted into a sneer. "Whatever you found out there, it's mine. Dad wanted me to lead this family, not you. You're just the widow." The word stung, but I forced myself to hold his gaze. "Careful, Daniel. Your father believed in consequences." His smirk faltered for the first time. That was when I knew he suspected the truth. Robert's fortune wasn't his for the taking, not unconditionally. And now, with both of us circling the secret, the real fight for the estate was about to begin. The morning after I returned from Montana, a thick envelope slid under my front door. When I bent to pick it up, I recognized the seal of a law firm. My stomach sank before I even opened it. Inside was a letter, formal, precise, cruel. Notice of petition. Daniel Briggs, executor of the estate of Robert Briggs, hereby seeks full authority over all financial assets, including property and accounts, on the grounds of fiduciary responsibility. At the bottom, Daniel's signature. My son was suing me. That same afternoon, the locks on Robert's study were changed. Daniel had hired a locksmith while I was gone. When I asked him to know why, he looked at me with cold amusement. Dad trusted me to protect the estate, he said, and I will, even from you. I should have crumbled. I should have wept at the betrayal. But something inside me had shifted in Montana. I no longer saw myself as a grieving widow, fumbling in the dark. I was Robert's partner, his equal, and he had left me the tools to fight. I called the only lawyer Robert had ever trusted outside of Daniel's circle, a man named Harris, grizzled and blunt, who had helped us close our first real estate deal decades ago. When I told him what Daniel was attempting, Harris didn't hesitate. Executor doesn't mean dictator, he said. And if Robert put contingencies in place, your son is playing with fire. Bring me what you found in Montana. That evening, I spread the files across Harris's desk. He read Robert's letter twice, then leaned back, his eyes narrowing. These changes everything, he said. If Daniel acts in bad faith, he forfeits his inheritance. Robert built an escape hatch, and your son is sprinting straight toward it. I felt a flicker of hope, but Daniel wasn't waiting idly. 2 days later, the bank called. Joint accounts I'd always had access to were suddenly frozen. Credit cards declined. Even the small pension deposits Robert had arranged were blocked under executor review. Daniel was choking me financially, cutting me off piece by piece. That night, I confronted him at the dinner table. This isn't just about money, I said. This is about control. But your father didn't raise you to be a tyrant. He laughed, bitter and sharp. Dad raised me to win. He built an empire and I'll expand it. You don't belong in boardrooms or contracts. You belong in memories. Memories. As though my place in Robert's life had already been reduced to photographs in dusty frames. I wanted to scream, but instead I smiled. If you believe that, Daniel, then you've already lost. His eyes darkened, but he didn't respond. He didn't need to had rattled him. The next morning, Harris filed a counterpetition, evidence of executors' bad faith actions, motion to contest authority. Attached was Robert's contingency clause. That evening, I received a call from Daniel's financial advisor. Mrs. Briggs, he said awkwardly, I need to warn you. Your son is pushing hard to liquidate assets, properties, accounts, even the Chicago penthouse. But his father's documents, well, they complicate things. You should be careful. I realized then that not everyone in Daniel's orbit was loyal to him. Some were already hedging bets, waiting to see which side would prevail. That gave me strength. I returned to Robert's study late at night, using the mantle trick again. Inside one of the bookshelves, hidden behind rows of dusty binders, I found a second folder. This one held recorded conversation business meetings Robert had secretly documented. And in one of them, Daniel's voice was clear, bragging to a friend about taking over everything once his father was gone, no matter what stood in his way. Evidence. Cold, undeniable evidence. The following morning, I placed the folder on Harris's desk. His eyes lit up. This isn't just bad faith, he said. This is intent. Your husband predicted this perfectly. Meanwhile, Daniel grew bolder. He showed up with movers one afternoon, striding through the house like a conqueror. I'm cataloging assets, he said as men lifted furniture, paintings, even Robert's old desk. I stood in the doorway, my voice steady. Touch one more thing, and I'll call the police. He smirked. On what grounds? I met his gaze. On fraud. On forgery. on intent. Your father left a trail, Daniel, and I found it. For the first time, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. It was quick, almost hidden, but it was there. And at that moment, I knew the balance was shifting. Daniel thought power came from money, but Robert had built power on preparation. And I was finally ready to use it. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the benches, scribbling notes as though this was some corporate scandal instead of a family unraveling. But maybe that was exactly what it was. A dynasty built on steel and sweat, crumbling under greed. Daniel sat across from me at the long table, his suit crisp, his chin lifted. To the outside world, he looked like a grieving son stepping into his father's shoes. But I knew better. I knew the venom behind his smile, the arrogance that thought he could strip me of everything Robert and I had built. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Papers rustled. The air felt heavy. Daniel's attorney spoke first, painting me as an emotional widow unfit to manage complex estate affairs. His words were sharp, calculated. Mr. Briggs entrusted his son with authority because he understood the need for competence, vision, and youth. When he finished, my lawyer Harris stood. His voice was gravelly, deliberate. Robert Briggs was not a man who acted blindly. He was methodical. He left behind not just wealth but instructions, contingencies for integrity, for honesty. This estate was never meant to be a prize for greed. It was meant to be protected by those who earned it. He handed the judge the folder I had carried from Montana, the letter in Robert's handwriting, the trust conditions, the contingency clause, and then the recordings. The courtroom speakers filled with Daniel's voice, clear and smug. Once Dad's gone, it's mine. It doesn't matter what she wants. I'll push her out. She won't fight me. She doesn't have it in her. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Daniel's face tightened, his lawyer shifting uncomfortably. I watched my son's confidence flicker like a candle in the wind. But the final blow hadn't landed yet. Harris leaned forward. And here, Your Honor, is evidence of Mr. Daniel Briggs's intent to liquidate assets prematurely in violation of his fiduciary duty. Bad faith. Plain and simple. The judge's gavel struck. We will recess for deliberation. As the courtroom emptied, Daniel leaned toward me, his whisper laced with venom. You think you've won, don't you? This isn't over. I turned my head, meeting his eyes. It is, Daniel, because you underestimated the one thing your father valued most, foresight. When court resumed an hour later, the judge's decision was swift. Mr. Daniel Briggs, by acting in bad faith, you have violated the conditions set forth in Robert Briggs's will. Effective immediately, you are removed as executor. Authority over the estate reverts to Mrs. Linda Briggs. The words hit like thunder. Reporters scribbled furiously. Daniel's face went pale, his jaw tightening. For the first time, he looked like the boy he once was, angry, lost, cornered. But the law didn't care. The gavel struck again. Final. Absolute. After hearing, Daniel stormed past me without a word, his footsteps echoing down the marble hall. I wanted to call after him, to remind him that once, long ago, I had held his hand on his first day of school, cheered at his graduation, and whispered prayers at his bedside when he was sick. But that boy was gone, swallowed by greed. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. Mrs. Briggs, what will you do now? Do you feel vindicated? What happens to Daniel? I paused, the cold wind tugging at my black coat. I will honor my husband's legacy, I said simply. And as for Daniel, that's between him and his conscience. The cameras clicked, capturing the moment, but I didn't linger. I had no appetite for spectacle. Weeks later, the house felt different. Quieter, but not empty. Robert's presence lived on every wall, every photograph, every file he had left behind. I managed the estate with Harris's guidance, ensuring Robert's projects continued. His employees paid, his name respected. One evening, As I sat by the fireplace, I found myself holding Robert's letter again. Don't let Daniel steamroll you. He's headstrong, but he doesn't understand loyalty. You do. Tears stung my eyes, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of resolve, because Robert had trusted me, even when our son had betrayed us both. Daniel eventually moved away, out of Chicago, out of the spotlight. Rumors whispered of failed ventures, lawsuits, debts. I didn't follow the details. I couldn't. He was my son, but he was also a stranger now. One morning, months later, a letter arrived. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, Daniel's handwriting scrawled in uneven lines. Mom, I was wrong. I see that now. But it's too late, isn't it? I folded the letter carefully and placed it in Robert's folder. Because some stories don't end with reconciliation. Some end with truth. And the truth was this. Love can be broken. Trust can be shattered. But foresight, the quiet strength to prepare for storms, can protect what matters most. Robert's empire hadn't been lost to greed. It had been saved by loyalty. And loyalty, I realized, was now mine to guard.